Now I'd like to welcome our next panel, the last one of the day, to the stage, Revitalizing America's Aging Infrastructure, and introduce the moderator, Anthony Flint. Anthony serves as a fellow and director of public affairs at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, where he's engaged in writing and researching urbanism and development patterns. He's covered infrastructure, urban planning, and development for numerous publications, including the Boston Globe, City Lab, The Next American City, and Planning Magazine. Please join me in welcoming Anthony. Serving on the panel will be Patrick Sabol, Senior Researcher at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. At Brookings, Patrick works with US mayors, governors, federal officials, and Fortune 500 corporations to promote innovation in the infrastructure finance. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Brian Palash, Managing Director for Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers, where he's responsible for managing the group's focus on infrastructure issues. And finally, I'm honored to introduce the former mayor of Washington, D.C., Anthony Williams. Mayor Williams served 2 terms in office from 1999 to 2007, during which time he spearheaded the city's financial comeback. Prior to serving as mayor, Mayor Williams was the chief financial officer for the city of Washington, D.C. Currently, Mayor Williams serves as the CEO and executive director of the D.C. Federal City Council. Please join me in welcoming all the participants in the panel. Anthony, I'll turn the panel over to you.
Well, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think there's one thing we can agree on about infrastructure. It's that it isn't sexy. We get that. Although I applaud the cover of the program, which takes a pretty good run at it. Many of you may have seen John Oliver's recent discussion of infrastructure, where he actually created a terrific trailer for a blockbuster summertime adventure film about infrastructure. But I think we can also agree, especially in this room, that infrastructure is critically important, especially for our cities. We can agree that the need for increased investment in America's aging infrastructure, which famously gets that D+ grade year after year, including transit, roads, bridges, and airports. At the end of the day, the biggest challenge, as Congressman Capuano pointed out, certainly, is how to pay for it. As it stands, the main source of U.S. infrastructure funding at the federal level is, of course, the Highway Trust Fund, and that's predicted to become insolvent this summer, underlining the need to implement long-term policy solutions. And adding to that urgency is the expiration of the Surface Transportation Bill at the end of May, also as the congressman referred to. Well, President Obama reintroduced the topic to the American public, however modestly, in his State of the Union address in January, rolling out an initiative designed to enable more infrastructure-focused public-private partnerships for states and metro areas. The Qualified Public Infrastructure Bond Program extends financing for airports, transit, and ports in addition to roads and bridges, and the administration also promised to further strategize on public-private partnerships and, critically, to try to attract global investors for U.S. projects. Well, I would argue that meaningful dialogue about both the gas tax as a revenue source as well as the idea of an infrastructure bank really both have struggled to keep purchase. What's left is being smarter about infrastructure investments, making sure they get the most bang for the buck on a regional basis, and contribute to long-range sustainability and resilience. One of the more promising arrangements is the idea of performance-based infrastructure. California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia joined together recently to form the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, which I'd encourage you to look further into. It's sort of a kinder, gentler P3 approach that looks at longer-range outcomes as well as immediate returns. HUD's ongoing $1 billion National Disaster Resilience Competition follows a similar philosophy, requiring regions to walk and chew gum at the same time, to recover from disaster by being better prepared for the next one, and to achieve multiple goals in resilience and economic development. At the Lincoln Institute, a think tank just across the river, we've been working on one tool or method in particular for urban development, and that's value capture. Going all the way back to the 19th century political philosopher Henry George, value capture is based on the idea that public investments and government action lead to identifiable increases in property values for landowners and developers. And so in anticipation of that, at the front end, can a financial contribution be agreed upon by the private sector? Value capture is widely used in Latin America. I encourage you to go to our website to look at a report that surveys the experience with the tool in Latin America, value capture in Latin America. In Sao Paulo, for example, developers start with an FAR of 1, and if they want to build higher, they must buy certificates at auction, and the revenues from that flow to infrastructure and other improvements in the immediate area. So all of this, we believe, will lead to better municipal fiscal health. Our best cities are booming, but all cities from Stockton to Detroit to Baltimore so desperately need investment. As they just try to survive, really, they've been delaying all manner of capital outlays, just at a time when interest rates are low and construction jobs are in the offing. So it's this almost existential threat to urban infrastructure that we're examining here today, thinking creatively and more expansively about the path forward. So we are honored to be joined by Mayor Anthony Williams, Patrick Seibel, and Brian Palish. And let us hear first from Mayor Williams. If I could invite you, sir, to the podium. We'll have a series of brief opening remarks / presentations of about 10 minutes in length, and then we'll open it up for a broader conversation.
Hi, everybody. So what I want to do for about 5-10 minutes is, first of all, thank the Institute and everybody for having me here. Over my public service career and later, I've been to a lot of conferences. Many of them are a waste of time. No offense to you if you believe your conference was a waste of time, but this one is not. This has been, I think, refreshing. It's been very, very informative, and I'm glad that it's getting out there into the public domain. Really powerful presentation, so I appreciate that. Lincoln Institute, National League of Cities, and others. Very impressive. What I want to start with is I have some experience in Boston. I went to school over down the road at Harvard. I worked for a federal judge over in the federal court for a year. I was assistant director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So I spent a lot of time in Boston. I lived over in Roxbury, over across from the Universalist Church there. Beautiful view of the city. And what I like to do is I start out, and it is a segue to what I'm saying, but since like the congressman, I got the microphone, I want to do this. I want to talk about public trust, because finance and public trust are related, and P3s are so controversial because they get at notions of public trust. But as I start out and talking about public trust, having spent a lot of time here over the years, I want to give a shout out to my good friend, Tommy Menino. Tommy Menino was a superb mayor, and I'm speaking as a mayor of one of those fifth cities that you talked about. He was a superb mayor. You would not invite Tommy Menino to be your, speak to the UN Security Council on World TV because, speaking wasn't his big thing, but he was a powerful, effective mayor. And one of the best things Mayor Menino did, and I say this as an African American who spent a lot of time in Boston over the years, is I marked Boston from the time when I first came here, was about 82, 83. And last time I was here teaching over at Harvard, left a couple years ago. A lot of that time really captured, in those early 90s, Tommy Menino. We went from Anthony Lucas, Common Ground, a divided city in Boston, the perception of Boston around the world, you may not think so, was not good. And when I came back here, the tone of the place, the culture of the place, the spirit of the place was really, I think, transformed and changed by Tommy Menino. And that's a legacy of his that hasn't gotten enough credit, and I want to give him credit for that. Now that's important because it goes to public trust. And finance is about public trust. That's why P3s are so controversial. Now what do I mean by that? When Louis XIV designed the Palace of Versailles, he was looking to design something that would epitomize the center of the universe and the power of the monarchy in the universe. In other words, the power of the private realm in this universe of chaos. And as you look at all the papers in Washington, D.C., and the founders of Washington, D.C., it's breathtaking, their ambition. They actually envision a new capital of liberty in an empire, a public realm that would basically extend coast to coast, a public realm, not a private realm. And Washington was the center of the public realm of this new empire of liberty. And what are the components of this public realm? In my mind, this public realm, this democracy is a social compact. The social compact is about public service, it's about public safety, it's about public education, but at its heart, it's about public trust. What is public trust about? Public trust is about transparency. We've been talking about that. It's about accountability. We've been talking about that. And public trust is also very powerfully, and this is one of our most important obligations, particularly if we're in appointed or elected office, and that is we're public stewards, right, not just for this generation, but for the next generation. So in other words, we're not just responsible for equity, as Piketty would talk about equity, in the here and now between classes. We're also responsible for intergenerational equity to make sure that the next generation is doing at least as well as we're doing. We're also about accountability. And what do I mean by accountability? We're about accountability in that if you look at our constitutional government's about liberty. It is about equality, but in a boring way, in the same way we're all here at a boring financial conference and we're all boring financial people. Actually, one of the profound, fundamental, bedrock cornerstones of our constitutional framework is about what? Settled expectations. If I'm an investor or I want to live in your city, I want things at least as good a month from now as they are today. They don't have to be better, they just have to be the same. Settled expectations, very, very important to functioning government. So all those things, settled expectations, intergenerational equity, transparency, accountability, all that's so important when you talk about public finance. And all of this is really brought into controversy when you talk about P3s because everybody has all these different conceptions of P3s. And I want to just share some of the conceptions in my new role now as the CEO of the Federal City Council, which people think is a conspiracy to take over the city, but people who know Washington, and the congressman spoke very eloquently of this conspiracy. I mean, no one can plan a conspiracy in Washington and pull it off, so there are no conspiracies. But essentially, the Federal City Council was organized by Phil Graham, the father of Don Graham, husband of Catherine Graham, the Graham family, the Washington Post, to set up a organization of civic leaders, not in a self-interested way, but a group of civic leaders, initially business people, who would push hard to do projects in the city that but for this intervention would not happen. So if you think of the Verizon Center down there, Union Station, Pennsylvania Avenue, the Metro, these were pushed by this organization. So one of the things we're looking at doing now is looking at a gap in funding critical infrastructure, because our organization has been about infrastructure over the years. What are some of the tools we need to look at in order to do this infrastructure? So some of the misconceptions. One misconception, public-private partnerships are new. They're clearly not new. You go all the way back in history. There are toll roads that were financed, by quote-unquote private sector, not new. I talked about Mayor Menino. Mayors for years have been funding projects with an arsenal or a toolkit of different tools to fund a project. If you think all the different real estate projects and commercial reinvestment projects, you could label these and call these P3s. So P3s in and of themselves are not new. Private equity in projects in which the government plays a role is not a new concept either. America lacks the sophistication to see the value in P3s. I think America lacks the appetite for dumb P3s. So if you come into a city and you want to basically refinance your buildings, you better find another line of work because it's cheaper, obviously, to do your regular businesses, your regular operations, your regular processes in government using tax-exempt finance than it is to use higher cost taxable debt involved in a private equity deal. Another misconception, though, on the other side is that P3s normally, and just by their very nature, are going to cost a government more than a tax-exempt. Again, this depends. All this is conditional. A lot of this is circumstantial. Why do I say this? Because we talked about Gatsby earlier. One of the, they asked Moses, were these things written in stone? He says, it looks like they are, right? So Gatsby, it's kind of like things are written in stone, but like Moses, we don't always follow Gatsby. But one of the things that Gatsby has been preaching and saying for years is that we ought to account for our physical property assets, and we ought to also ought to tabulate and record our maintenance of these assets. And one of the problems in discussing P3s is we talk about the short-term financing costs of P3s, in which case they are prohibitively expensive, but we fail to factor in the risk exposure. We fail to capture the maintenance involved in these projects, which I think is very, very important when we talk about them. There are some spectacular examples if you talk about P3s, and I'll leave you with this notion. If you look at the capacity of a government to do P3s, the appetite of the public for P3s, the notion of the political landscape, because I'm running out of time, one of the worst things that can happen, and I'll give you some examples of where this has happened, the Texas State Highway, Georgia's Northwest Corridor, Florida's First Coast Outer Beltway, these all share a singular infamy, and what is that? Is they all were projects where essentially we thought the plane was ready for takeoff and it never made it off the ground. They basically were spectacular crashes. And I would urge all of you who are interested in public-private partnerships to do a couple of things. One, to start small, right? Don't try to resettle the moon with a public-private partnership. Start with a small project. Number two, organize the project in terms of the political interface, the government requisition project, so that you've built stage by stage, iteratively, plenty of public education and plenty of public engagement before you have any actual major outlays of cash and public commitments and a full ramp up of your procurement process. Because of projects I mentioned, millions of dollars were spent, then you had the public engagement, then the project crashed and burned. I actually am a big believer, and I'll wrap it up with this, that the public trust can work. I'm a big believer that the democratic system can work. And why do I say this? Because during the financial crisis in Washington, D.C., I was the CFO. We had to lay off thousands of people. I actually had to fire hundreds of people. And guess what? I was elected mayor of the city. And I'm not a great politician. And then I was mayor of the city, and I actually closed the public hospital. You know how hard that is? That's really hard. And guess what? Despite my best efforts, I was reelected. So I'm a big believer that it's more than Winston Churchill who said Americans will always do the right thing once they've exhausted all the alternatives. I'm a little more optimistic than even that. I believe that if you engage the public and you treat the public in a non-compromising manner, patronizing manner, and I think the congressman's an excellent example of that. If you have respect of the public and you have one or two things you want your public to do, I believe they'll follow you. And if you have one or two things where they're complicated, where they're hard, but where education is going to work, I believe they will work. And I think public-private partnerships properly delivered, properly managed, properly staged with the right kind of education can be just one tool of the many tools we have to solve our infrastructure problems. Thanks.
It's a very tough act to follow, both incredible public elected speakers, and I'm just but a researcher at a think tank. Hopefully I won't bore you too much with this. I'd really like to set the stage for how we at Brookings look at the financial situation, the fiscal needs of cities, really what the new innovative models are that are moving forward that are actually helping to actualize a lot of the things that the mayor's talked about. So first of all, I think it's important to address the big picture changes that are forcing us to really reconsider how we fund and finance infrastructure. We have huge demographic and cultural change in the United States, which is actually unique around the world. We have growing urban density. We have the suburbanization of poverty, which are both having huge influences on the transportation networks and assets that we need. We have economic globalization, which is really forcing us to reinvest in our global gateways. It's major bridges in places like Detroit, border crossings with Mexico and Canada, our largest trade partners, and also ensuring connectivity between our metro areas, which actually produce 70% of all of our GDP. Finally, we have climate change, which is affecting the United States in serious ways and really changing the types of investments we need to make. We're seeing that out west with huge push towards even desalination plants and all sorts of infrastructure assets that wouldn't have even been considered a decade ago. We're looking at all sorts of resiliency plays that we're seeing in New York around ensuring transportation. That's really changing the way we're approaching infrastructure investment. On that backdrop of kind of macro trends, we also have huge shifts in the way we actually fund infrastructure in terms of which level of government is paying for what. We should be at about 4% of GDP in terms of infrastructure investment. We're at about 2% right now. And if you look at the general trends, state and local governments are picking up a large amount of the slack as the federal government continues to pull back, not just in big areas like the Highway Trust Fund, which we've talked about, but also water, public buildings, a variety of other sectors. But before we get to the really exciting stuff of cool new tools, I think it's really interesting to talk about the fact that we have a really robust infrastructure financing market that is really the envy of the world. In 2014, we had $341 billion in tax-exempt financing. That's really a huge lever that every other government in the world does not have access to that kind of speed and ease of market. And we have $35 billion in private activity bonds that will be issued in the coming year. That's going to support airport developments. It's going to support schools, waterway facilities. And really, these are huge sums of money that we kind of lose track of when we talk about the Highway Trust Fund or other federal programs, because these are state and local governments really doing it themselves. And also, we have huge success with just going to the voters, just going out and selling ballot initiatives, whether that's for a gas tax increase, a sales tax. We're seeing 60, 70% passage rates for these, and it's happening across the political spectrum in both very conservative places like Wyoming and liberal places like Maryland. So really showing that in a place like Oklahoma City, not necessarily a bastion of what most people would consider big city density initiatives, they're putting in light rail projects, they're raising ballot initiatives like clockwork to support new infrastructure investments, mostly as a pay-as-you-go model. So even though we have all these great tools and we've really, as a country, have an enviable infrastructure development finance market, I won't spend too much time on this because it's been the last 3 panels, I believe. We really are facing huge crowd out from other sectors that are eating into cities' budgets. We're talking about, for this cohort, around 13% of all budgetary outlays for cities, and I believe this is a 20-city scan, go directly into pensions. That's a huge obligation that's eating away the ability to make investments in new infrastructure capacity. Of course, we have political dysfunction. We're seeing a lot of this at the state and local level. Again, we heard a lot about this in terms of tensions, especially with the mayor of Madison, in terms of devolving to local control, allowing new taxation measures. That's really holding a lot of cities back and hamstringing them from being able to take control of their own infrastructure agendas. Debt limits. So this takes a little bit of explanation, but after the Great Depression, pretty much every city and state in the United States set up a fairly arbitrary limit on how much they could borrow, and this is unrelated to the ratings agencies. Usually it's based on percentage of property tax assessed value. And so some cities, like Billings, they can barely borrow at all, even if they have great investment opportunities. Other cities have huge ability to borrow. Some cities, we actually did a scan of, I believe, 350 consolidated annual financial reports, which was incredibly boring. But a lot of cities even disregard their own debt limits. So it's really a mixed bag. And in Washington, D.C., it's also been a challenge in terms of getting around their debt cap. And again, these are just kind of tied to a political campaign and not necessarily any grounding in reality. This is just a showing of where states are in terms of rebuilding, but you could also replicate this for cities. We're still in a period of time when we're coming back from recession. So cities aren't really excited to invest if they still feel like they need to invest in maintenance issues that they've deferred for years, or if they just want to build back up their rainy day funds. Finally, and we've talked about this a lot, this is just showing the state of the Highway Trust Fund. We have a really unreliable partner in the federal government. You look at a state like Tennessee, which has said that they are not going to invest in any new highway capacity until they find out there's a resolution to the Highway Trust Fund. You have major corporations in South Carolina. Michelin just said that they are unwilling to expand their plants there until they find out what's going to happen with the Highway Trust Fund because the transportation assets are so necessary for them. So really, we're seeing this unreliability of the federal government in terms of passing a long-term transportation bill, affecting states and locals' ability to actually get the projects done that they want to get done. But on that backdrop, I think it's great to address some of the things that are actually happening and seeing states and localities really stepping up and trying new things. And I think this fits in very well with what the mayor was talking about with public-private partnerships. So I think they fall into 4 major categories. One are new bonding approaches, and certainly there are things like green bonds and century bonds, but particularly I think is interesting is distributed infrastructure. So sounds kind of boring and gross, but using tax-exempt bonds or even taxable bonds to buy toilets back or to get new water efficiency in private people's homes, and not just using money to build a giant new concrete culvert, but to distribute the infrastructure across private sector homes, businesses, around the entire system. Dedicated public-private partnership units. These are units that actually help negotiate these deals. They bring the expertise, and they bring a lot of the bureaucratic capacity to get PPPs done. It was mentioned earlier about the infrastructure exchanges. This is a new idea. I can delve a little bit more into what they do in terms of aggregating up projects and setting standards. But I think that's a new emerging model, especially with the federal government not being in the picture on a lot of these things. Finally, infrastructure banks and trusts. These are structured in very different ways, and certainly the Chicago Infrastructure Trust has gotten a lot of attention, but also the Green Bank in California and the Green Bank in Connecticut, as well as some other local, smaller uses of state revolving funds in better ways. So now that I've kind of covered those, I want to go in depth on individual projects and how these actually are playing out in different parts of the country. And I'm going to go from P3 units all the way over to exchanges. But a good project, and I know there was actually some hate for this project, but the hot lanes, the high occupancy tolling lanes in Virginia, I think are a very interesting example of a P3 that was run through a very successful process, which actually saved the taxpayers money and reduced congestion on a key corridor. Fundamentally, Virginia had struggled for really decades to be able to reduce congestion on a key arterial, 495, going from the suburbs into Washington, D.C. They really couldn't find the money. They would have to tear down a lot of houses. It was politically contentious. Because Virginia had a really robust P3 legislation and they had a unit that was capable of analyzing the financials, they were able to take an unsolicited bid where Fluor and Transurban, 2 very large companies, came in and said, you know what, we have a solution that I think will work great. We'll take the financial risk, we'll take the revenue risk in terms of if people don't show up and use these special lanes. We'll introduce really interesting technology that allows you to charge different tolls to different people depending on the time. And it got a really strong project that's working out well, that's actually expanding in the region. And even though it has not really hit its revenue targets, the public sector isn't getting hurt by them not hitting their revenue targets. Fluor and Transurban took on that risk. So actually the public sector really won on this, as did the people of Virginia and DC. Chicago Infrastructure Trust, I think, is very interesting. They're serving almost as an investment bank for the city in terms of going around and organizing deals. And again, not necessarily the sexiest project, but I think a cool thing they recently did is they partnered with Siemens, which is a large multinational engineering firm, to basically redo the energy efficiency for all the swimming pools in the greater Chicagoland area that the Parks Department administrates. The Parks Department has serious financial issues for the city, and it's a drag. Being able to go to Siemens, partner with them to have energy efficiency upgrades throughout their entire system saves real money. It's smart use of off-book financing for the city. a city that has done a lot of crazy, not so great financial things, as many people here know. I think this is a really smart deal that saves the city money. They're going to get great pools. It's going to free up bonding capacity for the Parks Department to deliver the types of projects and services they really want to deliver and not operating a 60-year-old pool pump. I think the new bonding strategies, in terms of finding cool ways to use tax-exempt bonds that haven't really been done in the past, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, I think, is a real leader here. They've been doing all sorts of toilet buyback programs. They've been doing distributed rain gardens throughout the city that both help manage the rain when it finally does come to Nevada, and also really reduce the cost for the Nevada Water Authority, which is always under really strong fiscal constraints just due to the fact we built a massive city in the middle of nowhere. So that's really worked out well, and they're trying to adapt this in places like New York. Washington, D.C. is working on initiatives like this, and Philadelphia is actually a huge leader here as well, but they didn't manage to bond it because of a constitutional issue, which is not worth talking about here. Finally, we've got the exchanges, and those were touched on very briefly. The exchanges kind of sit above all these in terms of not being project-specific, in terms of really getting their hands dirty, in terms of structuring a deal. What they're doing, particularly the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, which is a partnership between California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, is to work together to develop standardized practices and really do a lot of hand-holding for state and local governments that want to get involved in public-private partnerships. So they're doing a lot on setting standardized labor agreements, helping state and local governments know what a good term sheet looks like, helping them understand what the fundamental issues are in P3s that maybe at the local level they don't have the capacity or time to worry about. And I think fundamentally, and most importantly, they're aggregating up projects. So when the private sector goes to the West Coast Exchange, they can see there's a variety of projects. They're not going to spend all the time to figure out one market and then find out that it's going to be 10 years before the next deal happens. It really helps build up a market where the private sector will go again and again and again, and the public sector will have more and more opportunities to learn and deliver projects that will really help their citizens. So I'm happy to take questions on any of these when it gets to the Q&A, but I appreciate your time and looking forward to hearing from Brian.
Thank you all very much for letting me be here. I am Brian Palish. I'm with the American Society of Civil Engineers. We're the oldest national civil engineering association, oldest national engineering society. We're not the oldest because the Boston Society of Civil Engineers is the oldest. So it's one place where I have to make sure I say that right. And on behalf of our 140,000 members, it's great to be here. Mayor, I just want to say one thing. I saw you last week at the baseball game, and thank you again for the work you did to bring the baseball team to D.C. As a 10-year season ticket holder, I know you guys here in Boston don't care about this. In D.C., we were without baseball. We have baseball. It's made it a much better city, I think, and that area of town is certainly different than when you started as mayor, I think, as a fair assessment of what you can do when you want to go ahead and rebuild the city. So thank you. I'm here to talk about the state of our nation's infrastructure. I agree with going ahead and taking a look at what John Oliver did. If you're interested in sort of the fun way to look at infrastructure, I urge you to go to YouTube after you hear my presentation and see how what his take on infrastructure is. From the American Society of Civil Engineers perspective, we have a serious problem in our nation. And frankly, what we have is infrastructure that we've put in place in the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and we have not really maintained it. And in cities like Boston, where you're an older city, obviously, we have significant infrastructure problems. The first thing we talk about when we talk about infrastructure is really taking a look at what the vision should be for the nation for infrastructure. This is a difficult task. Folks don't like to spend time doing this, but the reality is the infrastructure is the core of the economic backbone of our country. If we don't have good roads, if we don't have a bridge system, if we don't have a good port and inland waterway system, we don't move goods around this country. Folks can't get to and from work. And as a result, the notion of of having a vision and actually being able to tell people what we want to see in the future for our infrastructure is an important part of that. We brought a group together and put this vision together. I think it's a little bit easier, maybe not at the local level for you all as local officials to bring that vision, because you can say that your vision may be that you'd like to have this arterial fixed, you'd like this bridge to be fixed, you'd like this new transit center to be put together. At the national level, it becomes a little more complicated because what you're talking about is hundreds of projects or maybe thousands of projects. Every 4 years, we have the pleasure, I guess, of releasing what we call the report card for America's infrastructure. Hopefully everyone in the room has seen it. It gets pretty decent media coverage. We're pretty proud of that. But ASC goes about a process with a group of our members of looking at the 16 categories that we have up there of infrastructure and figuring out, are we doing better or worse? We started this process way back in 1998, and we've done it ever since then. And in the most recent report card, which was released in 2013, the U.S. Got a grade of a whopping D+. Not something you'd like to bring home to your children if you're a kid, and it's like worse than a phone call from your teacher probably, a phone call home. And as we looked at the infrastructure in 2013, I think there were a couple things that we found, I think, that are important for you all to note. We continued to see categories of infrastructure that were not in good repair and were continuing to lack in their performance. They were actually causing economic problems for the society. The backlog of projects keeps growing. Folks are not spending the kind of money they should on operations and maintenance, which actually makes the repair costs later on much more significant. And really, as you can see, the overwhelming number of the grades are actually in that D range, not really a great report card. I would say this, though, about the report card, and it leads to some of the solutions that we've found, is that in spite of the D+ grades, that's actually up a little bit. It was a D in 2009, so I'm not sure that that's, it's at least trending in the right direction. There were noticeable and tangible improvements in a number of categories, and you can see those by the arrows behind me. But what we found when we looked at that, when communities got together and when states and local governments, and in fact the federal government, invested resources, picked the right projects, and actually focused on rebuilding the infrastructure, we actually saw improvement. So the areas that you see there in the rail sector, the private rail companies and the rail system in our country, the freight rail system is a private system. They invested a tremendous amount of money in the years prior, in those years between 2009 and 2013. Now, part of the reason they did that, frankly, is there was a recession, so there was less freight movement, so there was less congestion on the rail, so they had the time, if you will, with a less congested system to make that improvement. But they did make those improvements, and therefore the system was better. In the roads and bridges and transit area, some of those grades went up in roads and bridges because of the ERA funding. The congressman talked about that. The reality is, with the ERA funding, as much maligned as it sometimes is in Washington, D.C., the money that was invested in infrastructure was pretty well invested. We found that there was a good amount of money spent on roads and bridges. In the wastewater and drinking water systems, there was a relatively, the money from the federal government was doubled for what they spend for that. And states are actually ready to spend money, especially in the wastewater and drinking water area. They've got things pretty well prioritized. And so if you give them extra money, cities and local governments have the wherewithal to go ahead and proceed on those things. A little discussion about what this means, though, and that is when you look out to 2020, that D+ grade, trying to translate that in what it is, we heard some big numbers earlier today about pension liabilities and healthcare liabilities. I thought this stuff was depressing that I'm going to talk about. That seemed way more depressing to me. And I actually think at the end of this, if we make some of these investments, we'll make our quality of life better, and we'll actually benefit the economy. Not that we won't do that in those other things, but I think there's for most citizens, there's a much more direct relationship to that. What we found when we looked at what we need in terms of investment over the 16 categories is that overall, as you can see, there's a need to spend about $3.6 trillion by the year 2020. which is a terribly large number. And when you come from Washington, trillions roll off your lips a little too easily than if you're at the more local level. But what we also found is that sort of that current level of spending, if you project it out, and as we did in 2013, that we're actually probably going to spend about $2 trillion in the nation. And that's at all levels of government. That's with the private sector as well. And so that the delta or the gap that we need to fill is about $1.6 trillion in that time frame. I will tell you, it doesn't appear to me at this point that we've done a lot in the last 2 years to start filling some of that gap. But the gap is in some ways a little bit manageable. You can see some of the gaps are a little bit smaller than others. The truth is the biggest gap, and it's at the top of the list, is in surface transportation. The congressman talked a little bit about the Highway Trust Fund, and it's one of those gaps that is a difficult one to fill. It is an area that is a struggle, and I'll talk about that if folks want to in the panel session. But it's a large number, and we look at that number, that 3.6. If you want to get to a B grade, which a B is good as a B student, I think that's a solid and good goal in life. The other thing we did in relationship to the report card is in 2012 and 2013, we kept getting a lot of questions being asked by the media and by members of Congress asking ASC, well, you know, we haven't done a lot of investing in the infrastructure since you started doing this report card. What does it matter if we don't? What happens if we don't invest? What happens if we keep limping along at the same sort of mediocre levels of investment? We know we're not doing the right thing, but what does that really mean? So we took about the process of doing some economic studies. We did not do them. We hired them out, got some economists involved, and tried to find out what happens if we don't start investing in our infrastructure. What's the impact on the economy at a national level if we don't start investing? The slide I have up here is from the final report, which rolled up a series of other reports together, and we redid the economic models. And I think the three numbers up there are important to note. And you guys can go online and get the study. It's at asce.org/failure to act. And you can dissect it and tell us what you think. But the first number is that one, the $3.1 trillion number. And if we don't start closing that gap, this is the GDP that's going to be lost in the United States. And it's not lost, it's unrealized, is the way the economists like to put it. So that's growth in our economy that we're not going to see because the infrastructure is sort of causing a constriction, and we're not allowed to grow the way we should. And that's a significant number. The number on the right is the number of job losses only in the year 2020. That's the way they calculate the job losses. That's a lot of job losses, as you can tell. And that is across all sectors. That's not civil engineers losing their job. That's not construction workers losing their job. That's across all levels. One of the charts that we have in the surface transportation report demonstrates if we don't invest in surface transportation, the area of job growth is in automotive repair, not shockingly, because we'll all be running through more potholes. We'll be doing things like cracking axles. I'm sure you guys are enjoying a great pothole season right now after the winter that you guys had. And that middle number is probably the most important number, and I think it's the one that grabs folks' attention the best. And that is $3,100 a year in sort of lost disposable income for the average family. And what that means is you and I are sort of forced, because of our bad infrastructure, to take money out of our pockets that we could spend on something else to address the infrastructure problem in our own life. For me last week, that meant when I popped a tire and bent a rim on a pothole, I think it was in Virginia, not in D.C., although there are a lot of good ones in D.C. that will swallow your car, that I had to spend about $600 to fix my car. So I've already got $600 in this year to my $3,100. In addition to that, it's things like lost time when I'm stuck in traffic. It's lost time if you have to rearrange your daycare and pay more for that. It's if the electricity goes out and you lose the contents of your refrigerator. It's all things like that. It's having to shift resources into a different area that you'd rather spend on something else. And $3,100 is a significant amount of money. When we look at solutions, there's a few things, and I was pleased to see the congressman talk about the notion of leadership. It's one of the things I find a little bit lacking in Washington, D.C. He's not here to hear me say that. There are no shortage of solutions out there to fix some of these problems. What I think we have is a lack of elected officials who are willing, if you will, to stick their necks out, certainly at the federal level, to actually make that, to make some changes and to actually stick their neck out and say something, as the congressman said, raise the gas tax. Something so simple. The Highway Trust Fund is having issues, as you all heard today, and something so simple as that. The second one is sustainability and resilience, and that's kind of an engineering solution, as I call it. But it's really, and we've got some local officials in here, it's really this idea of when you're going to go build a project, look and see whether you can do it in a more sustainable or resilient fashion. And in fact, more importantly, and this gets a little bit more engineering, look at the life cycle of that project. What are you paying for? How much is the O&M going to be? What's the total cost of the project? If you take the low bid, and maybe it might be the right thing to do to take the low bid, you need to understand that that may increase your maintenance costs 5 years out, or it may lower your maintenance costs. And actually asking some of those questions, we did a report with the Enos Center on how to deal with the policy implications of talking about life cycle cost. And what we found is a lot of folks don't know enough about it, and folks should be asking more about it, especially at the local level. And then finally, prioritize, plan, and fund projects. The reality is we need to pick the right projects that we're going to build. Maybe not every project does need to be built, but the ones that we do need to build, we need to plan them and fund them properly. And with that, I think I'll end. How's that? I got the times up.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, you know how moderators will sometimes say, you know, apologize, I'm standing between you and lunch. Forget that, I'm standing between you and cocktails. And after discussing infrastructure, we certainly all perhaps could use a beer. And after talking about financing infrastructure, we could probably use a martini. So in this remaining time, I'd like to open it up to all of you. I think there are folks around with a microphone or otherwise just stand up and ask our panelists any question that comes to mind. Just identify yourself. I will start. Patrick, I wondered if you might give me your perspective on value capture. I know this might be a little bit of a coming out of the blue, but this idea that infrastructure shapes the value of our urban development in such clear ways. It's being used in plenty of other places. Massachusetts is looking at it as a possibility in the study of financing transportation right here in the Bay State. What's your take on whether value capture might have any purchase in this country?
I think the jury's in. Value capture is a highly effective way to pay for things and actually get the private sector to put in the money they want to get the development done. It's how we built the railroad system in the United States. And we've seen huge success around the country. I think a hard part for a lot of state and local officials is trying to find the projects that will actually work for that. And actually, going back to Virginia, I think they're doing a really good job of doing a complete audit of assets they own and seeing where they can do things like bidding off air rights and where the density works that you could actually do value capture. A lot of places would love to do it, but there really isn't enough there aren't enough people there or businesses in the outset to really have predictable cash flows. And so a lot of these are low-hanging fruit where I think you really just need to look at what you have in your urban environment that might work for this. The Big Dig used some air rights, actually. And I think there's a lot of possibility to do that. If you look at places like New York City, they've gone all in with Barclays Center and the Atlantic terminals. I think it's going to be a huge part, but I don't think it's going to be usable for every place.
Okay, the question is, what's the criteria for, or what's more the mechanics of the process for implementing value capture? And if I can, Patrick, you can pick up on this, but in Latin America, it's a matter of quantifying the land value increment, the increase in property value that's associated with a piece of infrastructure or a government action. And a government action can be a zoning change or allowing increased density or height. So there's a formula, and that results in the contribution by the developer. They've brought it to a sophisticated level in Brazil, again, in Sao Paulo. These certificates, they have a wonderful Portuguese name, but which I can't pronounce. But these certificates are actually sold on an auction on a Wall Street-like market in Sao Paulo to be able to build, and so it really changes the overall paradigm for building in a city and recognizing the way that these public investments really contribute to this increase in property values. And at the moment, that's really just being given away. So that was Henry George's view, which was that windfall was just being enjoyed by landowners and developers.
Yeah, if you see places that have really failed with doing that kind of stuff, it's where it was really kind of crazy real estate developer led, basically predictions about what the growth and base would be. And so California got way ahead of themselves. I believe it was in the 80s when they had a bunch of their value capture deals fall through. So I think that's right now, it's again, like the mayor is saying, it's kind of baby steps. I think a lot of places need to look at kind of incremental projects, especially where there is that density, where you can really make the case right away, as opposed to going to a completely greenfield area and just say, if I build it, they will come. That's a little dangerous, and we've especially seen that with some toll roads that were done like that. The Pocahontas Parkway in Virginia was a disaster of almost a workaround to a value capture model where they built a big road out in the middle of nowhere and just assumed that real estate would come around and support it. So I think that's really a tough balancing act for states and localities to walk on. So I think it really is getting in early, trying smaller projects, unless you're in New York and you just go all in and do a $5 billion facility, but it's a different story.
Mayor Williams.
A great example of a value capture, if you all are in DC, go walk north of Union Station to the NOMA station and the area around the station. All that was essentially done back in the day by value capture. City put in a part, federal government put in a part, and the developers put in a part of the value that would be created by the station and the adjoining property. And it definitely worked.
It worked. All right. Let's see. Where have we got? Yes, please.
Hi, Darrell Jones, controller for the city. I'm one of the point persons in bringing high-speed broadband to the state of Connecticut behind Mayor Tony Harp. It's interesting. I had a question for Mayor Williams and also for Brian. It's interesting that you brought up disposable income. Now, do you, just considering high-speed broadband as an infrastructure project, because we kind of do, in a sense, because the impact on it is incredible. And Mayor Williams, what are some of the other things to be aware of the P3s? Now, you made a very good point of educating the public, and that's what we're doing next week. We're having this huge conference to educate the public on the public benefit of high-speed broadband, because so many people are like, it's going to be the way of the future. I mean, in terms of what we do, how we work, where we live, gaming, kids like to play gaming, but we're really taking it serious. We're not getting help from the state. We're not getting help from, we're getting support from the feds, but not really, but we're taking it on our own. And you said start off small, but we almost got to critical mass is critical to building high speed, to build it out correctly, because we're trying to do it for an entire state. So there's a lot of questions, sorry.
I say start small because a lot of governments, this is where the exchange out west is good. It's good just generally because governments need to cooperate more. That's a long story, but so it's good in that. It's also good in this respect because governments often set out on initiatives for which they're ill-equipped. And they end up, it's like setting off on the expedition. They end up perishing in the desert because they really were well-intentioned. There was a great vision, but they didn't have the capacity and tools to get the job done. So that's very, very important. That's why I would mention starting small. And, in terms of broadband, this is one area where it's easy for me to say, because he's now left, I disagree with the congressman. I thought his comments were great, but I disagree with him on the notion that, for example, the success, as you mentioned, Pat, with Virginia and their toll road, that this means that all the folks, who can't pay are in the slow lane. First of all, it's improving traffic in general. So if it's working, there really shouldn't be a really slow lane, congested lane, everybody else speeding by in their, latest model Mercedes. And also, with a global economy, deregulation, all the changes in our economy, the lines have now blurred as to, or put it this way, the definition of what's a public good is changed now. So because of deregulation and the way capital markets have worked, you could say that now airline travel is pretty much a public good. It's not like the day back when a lot of us were growing up where you got dressed to get on an airplane, only a privileged few took a flight. Now everybody takes an airplane, pretty much everybody, and yet they're classes of service. So I mean, it hasn't broken air travel to have classes of service. I don't think it's going to break the public realm or the public good to have classes of service, so to speak, on the roads.
I'd only add on the broadband, you're right, it is a form of infrastructure. As ASCE, it's not on a report card. We get the question a lot. I think that was your question. May not have been. Because civil engineers aren't in charge of that kind of infrastructure. If you look at the rest of the list, ports, inland waterways, bridges, dams, levees, you got a civil engineer involved, so we had to cut it off. Civil engineers don't like to talk about things they're not expert in, so we cut them off on broadband. So, but it is an area that when I go to infrastructure meetings like this and others, where usually it is a significant topic of discussion and one where there's a lot of conversation and the need to do more in that area.
And just quickly, I'd encourage you to check out the Gig U initiative, which Blair Levine ran, who now, just a quick plug for us, he's now at Brookings, but he's chief of staff for the FCC. He built the original broadband plan for President Clinton, and he's gone around the country and helped set up these smaller scale public broadband networks. He was big in Chattanooga when they did theirs. He's releasing a lot of reports on really practical, pragmatic, and also how it all fits in with FCC and state and local rules. So if you just Google him, or afterwards I can give you his contact information, there's really great stuff on how to do kind of grassroots stuff. He helped in North Carolina with those efforts as well. I think it's really going to be essential for hitting on a lot of equity issues happening around the country as more and more documents are delivered by the internet. You can't get a job at McDonald's without an email address now, which that's terrifying for people who are worried about equity concerns, and you can't do that on a phone. Those are things that cities are going to have to address.
We have one.
Catherine Lusk, Executive Director of the Initiative on Cities. Thank you all, for everyone in the room, for participating, and for the gentleman on the panel. I'm curious, here in Massachusetts this winter, there was a catastrophic failure of our public transit system. And there was a lot of discussion about the weighing net new. So weighing the sort of, rewards and sales process of expanding infrastructure versus investing in what we have and properly maintaining what's already in place. And I'm curious if you could comment on the inherent tension between those two, both from the process of what Capuano, Congressman Capuano was speaking about, and the sales process of getting your constituencies on board, getting your peers on board for that ribbon cutting, versus the realities of where the money actually needs to go right now.
Mr. Capuano, well, I don't want to say, most members of Congress don't go to ribbon cuttings for a repaving job. And so I think that is one of the dilemmas that we face. I do think with, I think we faced it in Washington, D.C., where the metro system, I'll use that as an example, and the mayor wasn't in charge of the metro system. They have their own governing authority. Our metro system in D.C. has expanded a great deal, but yet there was a time when most of the escalators were broken while it was expanding. And to me, that was sort of the the unique sort of right-in-your-face example of, well, we're going to take the Silver Line to the airport, all the way out to Dulles Airport, but you're going to have to walk up the DuPont Circle escalator, which is one of the longest escalators in the world. I mean, and so I think there's a dilemma where folks need to, and local governments and federal government needs to understand that investing in the operations and maintenance is an important part of what we're doing in our infrastructure, and that does in fact come first. You know, folks say, I can't believe they're repainting the bridge again. Well, they're repainting the bridge because it's made of steel, and if you don't repaint it, it rusts, and then you got to replace the whole bridge. So there's a reason that, you know, when they finish painting the Golden Gate Bridge, on the one end they go back to the other end and they start again. Well, that's part of the reason. It's an O&M activity, and our infrastructure is like that. You know, you want to do a pavement, you want to work on the pavement a lot. In the sense of you want to keep up your O&M on it so that you don't have to replace the entire roadbed system. And so I think it is the push and pull. The reality is we have a not growing pie for our infrastructure, for any of it, and as a result, we're not being able to make the right choices. If the pie was growing, we could grow the system, you know, expand the system, and also do the O&M. You know, we have 240,000 water main breaks every year in this country, and so we're not replacing enough pipe, but yet, you know, I mean, so we continue to have little factoids like that and problems like that, which is not a factoid when the water main breaks in front of your house. So I don't know if
You know, my own view is I don't totally agree with the congressman that if you're a mayor running your city, you know, you're supposed to be, I don't think he meant this, but your takeaway would be, well, there's really nothing I can do. We've got to wait for the federal government to come through with a slug of money. Well, mayor can't do that. If the stagecoach isn't coming, you got to start walking. Doesn't mean the stagecoach shouldn't come, but you got to do what you can do. On the other hand, our friend Bruce Katz, I'm not sure I totally buy into this notion that if you're a mayor, you can now revitalize your city, notwithstanding the federal government. They're really irrelevant now. I think that's crazy too. I mean, anybody who's a sovereign power who can write their own checks and not worry about the balance, you got to pay attention to, right? So, I mean, I think you got to take a nuanced view of this. I would go back to that first panel. If I'm looking at kind of refurbishing my toolkit and looking for the path ahead. One is this notion of regionalism. I think we really need to kind of re-energize that, because I think there have been 3 stages of the American city, and we're now into the 3rd stage in a lot of the 5th cities. So the first stage was explosive growth from industrialization. Second stage was catastrophic decline in many cities. Detroit's a great example, but DC, we lost half our population, went down to junk bond rating, Now we're in the 3rd stage of growth again. So our percentage of the regional economy is starting to grow. Why is that important? That means that our negotiating position with the surrounding suburbs is starting to get better and better. And now is a point of inflection, I think, to actually negotiate with the suburbs on how we do things, the way we approach things, and things like transportation. You know, so if we're doing some of these things, I would really urge us to look broadly at how we do them. The second point of engagement, and I think there are tools to do this too, is to really have a more serious conversation with our labor unions. I'm not one of these people who believe, well, the government employees are paid too much compared to the private sector, because I think that's a weird argument. On the other hand, we are where we are, and to get the enterprise moving forward, labor's got to contribute. And I'm a Democrat, and we got to find ways to do that.
Well, I think we were supposed to be doing it all, right? We were supposed to be maintaining the system and planning ahead for its expansion. But I would again argue that take the Green Line extension in Somerville, thinking in new ways about what that will actually accomplish and the urban future for Somerville and the transit-oriented development that can occur at those stations. That's where something like value capture again comes in. Same for the red-blue connector. We'll get all kinds of workers to MGH, so perhaps MGH can have a bigger role in that project. So just thinking about, you know, where the payoffs are, it's the red-blue connector would be terrific for the region in terms of economic development and jobs. but there are particular employers that it would benefit quite a lot. And could there be new ways of thinking about those kinds of expansion of the system? And let's see. Yes, please.
Thanks. Well, I'd love to talk about land value capture, and incidentally, in Brazil, they're called CPACs. I don't know what they are in Portuguese,
Yes, that's the
but
Portuguese
the
I
acronym
couldn't
is
pronounce.
CPAC. And I'd love to talk about regionalism and metropolitan government, but I'm actually going to ask Patrick a question. At the beginning of your presentation, you said something about infrastructure spending should be about 4% of GDP, and it's at about 2%. And I'm wondering where that 4% number comes from. Is that a rule of thumb that we can use in other countries as well, or is it based on specific data here in the U.S.? And secondly, if you're at 2% and it should be 4%, what are the implications of that?
So those numbers are international. The OECD developed the 4% rough benchmark. So that's why I always get frustrated when people talk about, well, China's got amazing infrastructure. They're dumping money down a toilet. 8% of GDP investment is a crazy amount to be spending, especially on some of the assets they're using. Japan for years has probably overinvested in infrastructure. So that's kind of a reliable number. McKinsey, I believe, said it's like 3.5 from one of their game changer study. So it's a vetted enough number. I've pulled up the hood. It's kind of sloppy how they put it together, but it's about as good as we can get for a lot of these things. In terms of how do we make up that delta of 2%, it's a huge number. I like using 2% GDP increase as opposed to Brian's number of trillions of dollars, because I think it's a lot easier for people to wrap their heads around, oh, we just need to shift a little bit of our budgetary discretion, as opposed to this horrifying smash your head in number of 4 trillion or whatever it is. So certainly I think we need to reevaluate things like gas tax, which definitely leverage up a lot of money. We need long-term sustainable funding from that. We need to figure out, if it's not the gas tax, what is it? Is it repatriation? Is it some other budgetary shenanigan that moves money around? We need to figure that out both short-term and long-term. That'll move the needle a little bit, but I really do think a lot of this is functionally going to be state and local government are going to have to continue to raise revenues and find new ways to invest. And certainly we're seeing places step up and do that. I think it's going to be really hard. I think one area where it's really going to have to move forward is going to be in water. Water is desperately underpriced across the United States. There are very few markets where it is at reasonable prices. You look at how difficult it was for a place like Detroit to bring their water sector around, the huge equity implications of cutting off water to low-income people. How do you manage that process? Out west, how do you deal with the farmers who have historical, I think some of those even like constitutionally enshrined water rights? How are you going to change that? And I think you're going to have to find a lot better ways to price that. And I also think we're going to get a lot more into dynamic pricing. So not just the hot lanes or the Lexus lanes where people get to go faster, but also we've done it with electricity for decades. Can we start doing that with water? Can we start doing it more with roads? Are there other areas where we can start doing price discrimination, which can get us, that we can actually reflect the value of the service we're providing people and really pricing it fairly? And I think there are subsidy programs we can set up as well. But it's 2% of GDP is a massive amount of money, and I don't have the answer for you.
It's a couple $1 trillion, Blair. I mean,
figured that
I
out,
would only add, I think that the notion, I think it was on one of the earlier panels, this discussion of transparency and being honest with your constituents and being honest with the citizens about the fact that, I think most folks know now that we have an infrastructure problem, right? ASC's done a pretty decent job of that. Others have been talking about it, Brookings and others, but explaining what that costs. At the risk of offending folks, it's time for mayors to not stand up and brag about not raising water rates, or maybe Mayor Emanuel bragging about he's never going to raise taxes in his next term when he knows the problems that he faces. Maybe you can get there. That's a good goal. But not raising water rates is not going to allow you to add any more pipe replacement or fix your CSO problem or some of the other water problems that you have. So, I think there's an issue where folks need to be honest with their constituents and say we do have an issue with the way we fund our infrastructure, and we need to spend a little bit more money. If I asked folks in the room what the federal gas tax was, I'm not sure you all may know that it's 18.4 cents. That's all it is on a gallon of gas. regardless of how much that gallon of gas is. If it's $9 a gallon or $1 a gallon, it's 18.4 cents. It hasn't been raised since 1993. That's absurd that we haven't raised it in that long, and we're using $1993 to try and pay for a 2015 infrastructure. And guess what? We're getting a 1993 infrastructure instead.
Okay, we just have a short bit of time left, so right here, and it'll have to be lightning round, and then we'll finish with you, sir, for the last word.
You mentioned a lot of cracks in our infrastructure. Can you speak of any security threats we might be exposing ourselves to?
Okay, so the question, I believe, is security risks that we are exposing ourselves to in the infrastructure scenario. And bear in mind, we'll just have to do this in sort of lightning round fashion.
Yeah, I think it becomes a resilience question. I think what happens is when there are effects, if there's a bad storm, if there's, I think it's when, I think the effects that we face are when there are events that we don't foresee that the infrastructure doesn't respond as well as we'd like.
I'd say, quick, very simple example, Detroit, we only have one bridge that goes across. Truckers are on their own recognizance to check in at a TSA facility further down the road. We cannot come up with the money, even though the Canadians are putting, I believe, $3.2 billion into building a new bridge for us with their own money. We can't come up with the $300 million for a TSA plaza to basically check on that there aren't explosives coming through our trade gateways. It's ridiculous. We do have serious security implications of failure to invest in these assets.
I'll leave it at that.
And the final, you'll have the final word.
That's because that guy that owns the tunnel.
Hi, my name is Zach Lax. I am a founder of a procurement efficiency startup, and I was wondering if you guys are prioritizing procurement reform or contracting reform when it comes to fixing some of these infrastructure issues.
You know,
On the subject of procurement.
From the infrastructure, from the engineering perspective, we reformed procurement back in the 70s. We have something called qualifications-based selection. We don't do low bid. Engineering services are about 3% of your normal big construction project, and we think you should hire the best engineer possible. And it really should be based on qualifications. So you want to hire a bridge engineer to build a bridge, not a wastewater treatment expert. So I think, and there are other things you can do. I think in lots of instances, design build's a great idea. You're not going to do design build for every project.
We should talk. I'm an infrastructure procurement reform dork. It's all I do. It's all I work with cities on. I love it. I think it's a fascinating area where we can save money and get better projects. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, you've got to make sure you've got the procurement system for the project you're doing. Reminds me of when I was growing up, I used to go to a beauty shop, and my mother, the beautician, had a sign, and it said, "Remember, ladies, you must have enough hair for the style you want. We are beauticians, not magicians." So you have to have the procurement system commensurate with the project you're doing.
Well, on procurement, well, if that's not a cue to segue to cocktails, I don't know what is. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this afternoon.